Hello, you guys. Ms. Shapiro is here, and we're going to talk a little bit about sustainability. There are two videos over sustainability, so please make sure you watch both. This is video one. So the first thing we want to talk a little bit about is some definitions, okay? So if you're watching this video and you're one of my students in Florence, we typically live in what we call a rural area. So we rely on natural resources. Think about your family and friends. How many of them have family businesses that rely on natural resources? That means that they do some type of farming or mining, or they do ranching. They're in charge of utilizing resources that come from the earth. So typically we can define rural areas as areas that rely on natural resources and have a less densely populated area. Previously, before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in rural areas as their family was affiliated with some type of farming. A few people lived in the cities, but that was not the majority. After the Industrial Revolution, more and more people began to move to urban areas. We can define an urban area as a more densely populated area that people have jobs that don't necessarily rely on natural resources. That movement of people from rural areas to urban areas is defined as urbanization. So take a minute to pause the video and record that. So urbanization is the movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. We define a city as an area that has enough resources to allow residents to specialize in either arts, crafts, or professions other than those based on resources. So maybe they work for some type of company, or they're a doctor, or they are a tradesperson that relies in the city, some type of mechanic, something along those particular lines. So that's a city. Now we've started to have these mega cities that have more than 10 million inhabitants. New York is an example. LA is an example in the United States. Other ones include Sao Paulo in Brazil, or Hong Kong, places like big cities in China. The largest one has 30 million people. Most of the cities in the United States are not true mega cities yet, but they're getting there. So this is typically, we saw a movement of urbanization, people from rural areas into urban areas due to transportation. So because we could transport goods all around, we didn't need to live close to urban areas. The rise of agriculture and the advent of coal fired or the steam engine really allowed us to move to areas because we could transport goods all around. So if we take a look at the figure here, right, understanding figures is a really important part of the AP exam. So what we see here is that we saw a commercial area and then a undeveloped land around it, and it was typically near water because that's how we got goods places on ships. And so as the more and more people started to move, this commercial area, it began to increase. We see the size of the increase. And then look at the residential area. So in the 1700s, it was pretty small, just slightly around. So residential meaning like where you live. But then here we saw that it began to grow. And then in the 20th century, it's really, really massive. We see these commercial, these more urban areas that have businesses, et cetera, surrounded by residential areas. And so what we see is that as people move, we start to destroy habitat. You see this wetlands area has started to get smaller and smaller, and we're going to talk about that. So this is typically driven by transportation. As transportation increases, cities can begin to grow because it's easier for people to move around. We can define the movement of cities outwards as urban sprawl. So remember that moving from a rural area to an urban area is urbanization. The growing of that urban area is urban sprawl. If you've ever been, if you guys that are here in Southern Colorado, if you think about, right, when you were younger and you used to drive from Colorado Springs to Denver, there was a big gap between like Colorado Springs and Monument, and then kind of when you got to Castle Rock and then into Denver. And now it's almost all developed. There's development all around the highway, and that's an example of urban sprawl. That Denver area is getting bigger. That Colorado Springs area is getting bigger. And so this is urban area that spread into rural areas, and it removes that boundary between the two. And this is driven by four things: automobile and highway construction, like we said, transportation, living costs, urban blight, and then also some policies. We can define urban blight as the degradation of a city area. And so this is just a picture of urban sprawl. So we see a city, so think like Denver is a great example of this. Pueblo is not really big enough for us to talk a lot about urban sprawl, although we can kind of see this a little bit with Pueblo West. So here we have the urban areas. Urban areas, right as the suburbs began to expand, we see more gasoline is used, therefore we do more highway construction. The suburban area grows even more. Oops, sorry. We see more traffic and construction. People have longer commutes. So this is urban sprawl, right? So people don't want to live in the city anymore. They begin to move outward, and because they have access to cars or maybe mass transportation, public transportation, that's relatively easy for them to do. This is caused mainly by the construction of highway and cheap gasoline. If gasoline is super cheap, there people are like, oh, it's no big deal to live far and to drive into work every day. So the use of gasoline tax money to build highways leads to the development of suburbs and traffic congestion. So cheap gasoline means that we're going to make more highways. Then we move outwards. Now people are going to live out, and then they drive into the city for work. And we call that urban sprawl. This sometimes leads to what we call urban blight. Urban blight is when an urban area becomes kind of degraded and not as good because people are moving away from that area. So if you've ever been to maybe like parts of Pueblo, right, they're not as nice as, say, the parts that are on the outside, or Pueblo West, that's a little bit of urban blight. So people move away to the city, from the city to the suburbs. Sometimes we call suburbs bedroom communities because you sleep there, your bedroom is there, but then you go to the city for work. And so as people move away from the city, sometimes the city doesn't have enough money from taxes because people aren't living there. The people that are living there don't have as much money, and so they're not generating as much taxes. It's hard to keep up the infrastructure. It's hard to continue to make it nice. And so we see that urban blight. It begins to kind of fall into disarray or fall into disrepair. It's not as maintained. There may be an increase in homeless population or buildings that aren't maintained, things like that. And so the urban area is not as nice, so people leave, then the neighborhood declines, the population shifts to the suburb. Now the city doesn't have as many people living there, so they're not collecting as many taxes. Maybe they stop bus routes, they shut down hospitals, and so that causes even more people to leave. And so that's an example of a positive feedback loop. In certain places, New York City has had this problem, Dallas, Fort Worth has had this problem, Denver is having this problem as well. We see what we call gentrification, and that's when it becomes really cheap to live here in the urban area because it's not very nice because the neighborhood has declined. And so developers go back in and they put in a lot of money and they move into these older rundown areas and they fix them up. They make them really nice, and that's really great. But the people who were living there are now no longer able to afford to live there, and they have to go somewhere else. It's too expensive for them to move to the suburbs. Maybe they don't have a car, their job is in the city, or they don't have a job at all. So they can't move to the suburbs, but now it's too expensive to live to the city. Where are they supposed to go? And that's kind of an example of what we call NIMBY, or not in my backyard. Like, oh, it's great for everybody to have a house and a job, but like, I don't want those people living near me. And that's kind of an example of NIMBY. Okay. So, like we said, urban sprawl is just the movement of that city outward. So, when suburban areas or outside areas begin to grow in, this is like how Pueblo West is continuing to grow into Penrose. That's an example kind of urban sprawl. And this leads to air pollution, water pollution, and habitat loss. We're going to talk about that in my other videos. So, stay tuned. And with that, that's the end of this. Please make sure that you tune into the next video that talks a little bit about the problems with urbanization and some of the solutions.